Julian Mace had never been a particularly sociable man, but that had never been a problem until recently. For years, he'd lived a quiet, respectable life in a modest yet tastefully restored home in an affluent suburb tucked just beyond the noise and tension of the city. His house sat on a tree-lined cul-de-sac, where neighbors waved politely without stepping too far into each other's lives, where silence was a form of respect, and privacy wasn't just valued. It was sacred. Julian, a former legal consultant specializing in heritage law and cultural asset protection, had, over the decades, curated one of the region's most impressive private collections of antique firearms. Each piece was thoroughly documented, licensed, insured, and stored under strict federal compliance, not because he feared the law, but because he respected it. His devotion to procedure was obsessive, almost sacred. These were not weapons to him. They were relics of history, tangible fragments of time, meticulously maintained and preserved with the care of a museum archivist. He had designed the lower floor of his home to serve as both vault and archive, with a climate-controlled room fortified by reinforced steel walls and biometric locks. Inside, each piece had its own case, its own documentation, and its own story. Some were American. Flintlocks and revolvers once carried by cavalry officers. Others were European. Pristine dueling pistols, Napoleonic artifacts, even a pre-WWI prototype that had never been fired. A few of the pieces had been acquired during his time in The Hague while working on restitution claims for items looted during the Second World War. And though his work had often been buried in legal minutiae, Julian had felt a genuine sense of duty in preserving these objects with the reverence they deserved. These weren't trophies. They were obligations. The neighborhood had changed in the last few years. New people moved in, younger couples, louder families, a different energy. Julian didn't resent it. Change was inevitable. But he noticed the shift. The old sense of deference to boundaries was eroding. Doors were left open. Cars parked half on the lawn. Strangers stopped to ask questions without introducing themselves. And then there was Karen Whitmore. She had moved into the house diagonally across from Julian's just over a year ago, after inheriting the property from her late aunt. At first, she seemed unremarkable. A woman in her late 50s with a stiff posture and carefully managed hair, always dressed as if she were heading to a school board meeting. But Karen didn't settle quietly. Within a month, she was attending neighborhood planning sessions, pushing for stricter noise regulations, introducing petitions to modernize community guidelines, and submitting complaints about trash bins not being stored on time. She called it civic engagement. Others called it a crusade. She claimed to care deeply about community safety, though it often seemed more about control than concern. Julian had no direct contact with her initially. She would nod from her porch if they crossed paths, sometimes hesitating as if expecting him to start a conversation. He never did. His days were spent reading, cataloging his collection, handling occasional legal consultations remotely, and tending to the greenhouse behind his house, which he kept stocked with rare orchids and bonsai trees. But Karen began to notice things. She saw delivery trucks arriving in the early mornings, discreet vans dropping off what she assumed were shipments of supplies. Once, she saw a crate being wheeled into Julian's house on a trolley by a man in gloves, who paused to scan the door. With a handheld device, Karen found that deeply suspicious. She asked a neighbor about Julian. "Retired lawyer, collects antiques," was the answer. "Keeps to himself, smart guy." But Karen's mind had already locked onto a different narrative. She didn't understand why anyone would need biometric locks on their basement unless they were hiding something. She couldn't fathom why a retired man would have shipments requiring signatures, barcodes, and steel crates. She convinced herself that he wasn't just a collector. He was stockpiling. For what, she couldn't say, but it was enough to stir her instincts. Karen began to take notes. Nothing elaborate, nothing paranoid. Just little observations. Times of deliveries, duration of visits, types of vehicles. She compiled these not out of malice but out of a misguided belief that she was protecting the neighborhood. If she were honest with herself, she'd have admitted that she felt increasingly powerless after her retirement, and watching Julian live with quiet, deliberate control over his domain reminded her of everything she felt she had lost. In her eyes, he was indifferent, cold, distant. That made him dangerous. One Thursday afternoon, she noticed that Julian's back gate was ajar. He had left in the morning, dressed formally, likely for some business matter, and wouldn't be back until the next day based on the routine she'd come to anticipate. The delivery man who arrived shortly after had a key. Karen watched as he entered the house briefly, left a crate inside, and locked the door behind him. But he hadn't touched the gate. Karen stood across the street, heart pounding, trying to decide what this meant. She had read that unmonitored deliveries were sometimes used to mask illegal inventory drops. This could be her chance to confirm it. What started as curiosity had hardened into purpose. She crossed the street, walked slowly past the gate, looked around. No one was watching. A single glance inside the house showed that the curtains were drawn. She stepped through the gate and walked around to the rear entrance where a small service door led into what she assumed was Julian's storage area. It was locked, but not heavily. She produced a thin metal hairpin from her pocket, a trick she'd read about online in forums about protecting your community from internal threats. It didn't work, but the attempt revealed something else. A panel beside the door, almost unnoticeable, covered by a wooden plate that had been nudged loose. Underneath was a key scanner, silent, dark, waiting. It looked like something from a research lab, not a private home. Karen felt a chill run down her spine. She took a picture of the panel, zoomed in to see the brand name and serial number, and stepped away. She didn't go further that day, but her thoughts did. That night, she began searching online for information about that brand, that scanner, the purpose of that kind of lock. It wasn't easy. Most of the results were for corporate buyers, logistics centers, artifact storage providers. She found one blog, hosted by a group of antique preservationists, discussing secure vaulting options for culturally significant assets. One paragraph mentioned that certain high-security systems were integrated with government notification protocols for breaches, particularly in collections that included military heritage items of international importance. Karen didn't know exactly what that meant, but it sounded important, dangerous. She didn't sleep well that night. Her mind was filled with images of explosives, black market trade, hidden bunkers, and Julian, always so composed, so untouchable, seemed now like the center of something much darker. She wasn't scared of him. She was scared of being the only one who saw what he was hiding. The next morning, she printed the photos, documented the date and time, and stored them in a folder marked Evidence. She was certain this wasn't just paranoia. She was watching over a neighborhood that had become complacent, and she, unlike the others, was brave enough to act. What she didn't realize, what she couldn't have known, is that the system she photographed had already logged her presence. Julian's home was more than a residence. It was a secured site, tied through a legal loophole to a federal registry meant to protect cultural property from theft or sabotage. And the moment Karen stepped onto his property with intent to interfere, the system had quietly triggered its first tier of response. Data logging, thermal signature capture, and automatic notification to the registry liaison assigned to Julian's. Collection. No alarms, no sirens, no police. Just silence. Quiet observation. Protocol. But the second tier, if triggered, would not be so quiet. And Karen was already one step closer to discovering what it meant to cross that line. Karen hadn't stopped thinking about that panel since the moment she found it. In the days following her brief, unauthorized inspection of Julian's property, her thoughts cycled in quiet intensity, fueling themselves with each new theoretical scenario she envisioned. She replayed every movement, every detail, The barely ajar gate, the brand logo on the scanner, the silence that surrounded her as she stood alone in another person's domain, driven not by malice, but by a need to validate what she had already decided. Must be true. She wasn't a thief, she told herself. She was protecting others. Still, some part of her, distant and largely ignored, felt the creeping unease of having stepped too far outside accepted boundaries. That part she silenced with conviction. If Julian was who she suspected, then law and order were on her side. What troubled her most was the system's design. That panel wasn't amateur. It had been installed with precision, and nothing about it was off the shelf. It wasn't a home alarm. It was infrastructure, something more permanent, deeply integrated. And the more she read about archival-grade security, the more convinced she became that Julian had hidden behind a collector's mask to store something that wasn't just valuable. It was potentially dangerous. She couldn't explain her obsession to others. She barely tried. But her notes grew more detailed. The schedule of his deliveries, the license plates of the transport vans, the names on the packages left at his doorstep. Karen watched, not out of hatred, but from a kind of righteous responsibility, convinced that no one else would see what she did. It was a Sunday evening when she finally made up her mind to act. The street was quiet, the sun low in the sky, shadows long across trimmed lawns and blooming hedges. Julian's car had not moved for 2 days, which was unusual, and although no delivery had arrived that weekend, she noticed something else. His curtains were drawn tighter than usual, and the back gate, the one she had passed through before, was once again unlatched. It was as if the house itself was inviting her in, daring her to look closer. She hesitated for an hour, pacing, waiting, convincing herself that she didn't need to do it, that she'd done enough, and then, as darkness settled in and the breeze cooled, she grabbed the gloves from her gardening shed, slipped on flat shoes, and crossed the street again. This time, she brought more than curiosity. In her coat pocket, she carried a small utility knife, a narrow flashlight, and a printed guide she'd found online describing how to override old biometric interfaces. The guide was designed for amateur technicians in museums who'd lost access to storage units. Not exactly the same context, but the language was similar enough to embolden her. She didn't expect success. She expected understanding. She would enter, look, confirm her suspicions, and then leave with the truth. That was her story. That was her plan. The back of the house was dark, and the service door was just as she remembered. Sturdy, unassuming, the scanner still dormant. Karen moved with caution, avoiding stepping on gravel or twigs, checking over her shoulder even though she had never once seen Julian with exterior cameras. Her flashlight clicked on with a soft buzz, the beam narrow and cold. She aimed it at the edges of the panel, searching for signs of a bypass latch or access seam. The guide suggested that some of these systems had magnetic overrides embedded beneath the casing, used for emergency resets or power failures. Karen pressed her fingers along the edges, applied pressure, and felt the faintest give near the lower right corner. Her heart surged. She wasn't imagining it. There was a way in. With the knife's flat edge, she nudged at the seam until a portion of the casing shifted. Behind it, a mesh of cables and circuit boards glinted in the light. There was a small recessed slot with a pinhole port, the kind meant for specific tools or, she imagined, for technicians with proper access. Karen inserted the end of a thin wire into the port, mimicking a trick from her research, and waited. Nothing happened. She tapped the wire once more, adjusted the angle, and then, suddenly, the panel blinked to life. A low hum sounded, barely audible, and the scanner glowed blue. She froze, her breath held, her body still as stone. Nothing exploded. Nothing screamed. The door did not open. But the system had reacted. Something had changed. Karen backed away slowly. She didn't need to go further. The activation alone was enough. She felt triumphant, validated. Julian's secret was more than a hobby. It was a system built for exclusion, built for secrecy. She believed now, without a shred of doubt, that what lay beneath that door wasn't just a personal archive, but a stockpile. Maybe not weapons, not in the traditional sense, but something powerful enough to merit silent protection, silent responses. She returned home that night exhilarated, her mind racing with possibilities. She drafted a letter, unsigned of course, outlining her concerns, citing the scanner, the shipments, the federal-style system. She printed it and mailed it to the local compliance office. She didn't expect immediate action. Bureaucracy was slow, but she had done her part. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that the panel's activation had not gone unnoticed. The system Julian had installed was linked through a private institutional network to a digital registry maintained by a division of the National Preservation Authority, a quiet agency tasked with safeguarding privately held heritage assets deemed nationally significant. Most citizens had never heard of it. That was intentional. The system did not issue sirens or public alerts. It sent encrypted bursts to authorized endpoints, alerting assigned liaisons that contact with the protected object had been made under irregular circumstances. The signal generated a case number, automatically forwarded to the central archive server and to Julian's legal custodian. The message contained a timestamp, heat signature metadata, and partial facial mapping, enough to verify that someone had approached and attempted a bypass. Julian received the notification late that night. He was in a hotel suite 2 counties away, meeting with a university archivist about a long-term loan program. The alert didn't trigger panic, it triggered protocol. He didn't return immediately, nor did he call the police. Instead, he contacted his attorney and forwarded the alert, along with a request to initiate Phase 1 response. His lawyer, a woman named Celeste Harlan, who specialized in cultural defense litigation, understood immediately what needed to happen. She would file the necessary paperwork with the insurance firm. They would notify the Preservation Authority, request a verification of the breach, and coordinate with the local storage facility to prepare for a temporary extraction of the collection. Julian's concern was not about loss. It was about contamination. If someone had accessed or interfered with his holdings, then every piece would need to be re-inventoried, re-verified, and potentially removed. Karen, unaware of any of this, continued her campaign quietly, feeding details to her folder. She began drafting a longer document, a kind of formal complaint or community petition. Though she hadn't decided who to submit it to, she felt empowered, certain that action was finally in motion, though she had no idea how complex the consequences were becoming. She thought she was stepping into a local matter, a neighborhood concern. What she had actually done was trigger a chain reaction involving federal registry alerts, legal teams, insurance assessors, and one of the most tightly regulated preservation systems in the private sector. And it was all documented. Every second, every breath. Her sense of safety was temporary. In the coming days, the consequences would arrive, formal, clinical, and entirely out of her control. 3 days passed before Karen noticed anything unusual. It began with the arrival of 2 unfamiliar vehicles early one morning, an unmarked moving van and a discreet black sedan that parked with clinical precision outside Julian's house. The van was long, clean, and bore no corporate branding, only a small barcode sticker on the rear bumper. From it emerged 3 men in dark blue utility uniforms, each carrying flat metal cases and scanning the exterior of the house with handheld tablets. They didn't knock. They didn't linger. The front door opened via keypad, clearly with authorization, and they entered with the quiet efficiency of professionals on assignment. Karen, who watched from behind the curtain of her second-floor bedroom, felt a sudden flicker of unease. These men didn't look like movers. They didn't speak. They moved in deliberate synchrony, like technicians on a highly specific task. She pulled out her phone, intending to record the scene, but hesitated. Something in her gut told her that filming them might be a mistake, not because it was illegal, but because she wasn't sure she wanted their attention. An hour later, the van was gone. The sedan remained. The man who had exited it, a tall figure in a gray suit with close-cropped hair, stood near the curb, talking on a phone, taking notes on a tablet. He wore gloves. He never looked around. He didn't acknowledge the street, the houses, the eyes behind windows. He behaved like a man fulfilling a duty entirely removed from the suburban reality around him. Karen began to feel something she hadn't expected. Not vindication, but anxiety. If this was the result of her anonymous letter, why had no one contacted her? Why had there been no questions, no confirmation, no visit? And who were these men? She kept her observations to herself. Over the next 48 hours, Julian's house remained sealed. No sign of Julian himself, no deliveries, no lights at night. And then, without warning, everything changed. On the third day, shortly after dawn, Julian returned. He didn't arrive in his usual car but was dropped off by a town car, another black, anonymous vehicle. He walked slowly toward his front door, dressed in a tailored overcoat carrying a leather folio under one arm. There was no smile, no glance toward the neighborhood. He unlocked the door, entered, and did not re-emerge for the rest of the day. Karen, glued to her window, expected chaos. She expected law enforcement, confrontation, investigation. But nothing came. It was too quiet. The following morning, she awoke to find a letter in her mailbox. Thick, expensive paper addressed to her by name. No return address, no stamp. Inside was a single sheet, printed with immaculate formatting, bearing the letterhead of a legal firm she didn't recognize. It began formally. Dear Ms. Whitmore, we are writing on behalf of our client, Mr. Julian Mace, regarding an incident of unlawful trespass and attempted unauthorized access to federally registered cultural property under custodial security as of September 2017. An investigation was initiated following a confirmed breach signal from the registry-linked preservation system installed at Mr. Mace's residence. Karen stopped reading halfway through, her hands shaking slightly. The language was terrifyingly precise. She wasn't being accused in the conventional sense. This wasn't a police summons or a neighborly complaint. It was a legal prelude, a formal notice from an entity that existed entirely above her expectations. The letter included a time-stamped log of the attempted access, a list of observed actions, and a request. Refrain from any further approach to the property pending review by federal and preservation authorities. It concluded with a final line, devoid of emotion. Failure to comply may result in immediate escalation, including but not limited to civil action and formal charges. Karen sat at her kitchen table for over an hour, rereading the letter until the words blurred. She had never been served anything like this. No police officer had shown up. No one had knocked on her door. But this felt heavier, more final. She tried to contact the office listed on the letter. The number rang twice, then went to an automated message informing her that no public inquiries were being accepted at that time, and to submit all questions in writing through certified channels. When she attempted to look up the law firm online, she found a sterile web page listing only a mailing address and a data portal locked behind encrypted credentials. The more she searched, the less she understood. These people were real, but invisible. Authoritative, but unreachable. And they were watching. In the days that followed, Karen withdrew. She avoided her neighbors, stopped attending her usual council meetings, and ceased her note-taking. But her silence didn't stop the consequences. A second letter arrived, this time from her homeowner's insurance provider, notifying her that a claim had been filed referencing potential liability for damage to restricted private property. The details were vague, but the implications were unmistakable. Her intrusion, however brief and incomplete, had triggered a procedural cascade that now reached into her personal affairs. Then came the email from her digital storage service. Her cloud account had been flagged for unusual access patterns, and 2 of her archived folders were now locked pending review. One of them had contained her photos of Julian's panel. She began to realize just how far the ripples had traveled. This wasn't about a gate left open or a harmless peek behind a door. She had entered a protected zone, legally defined, federally acknowledged, and sealed under regulatory oversight, and she had done so without clearance, without justification, without even understanding the scale of what she'd breached. Her neighbors remained silent. Some seemed to look away when she passed. Others no longer responded to her waves. The same community she once claimed to protect had quietly withdrawn its support, unsure whether to pity her, condemn her, or avoid her entirely. Julian, for his part, said nothing. He resumed his routines with quiet efficiency. Deliveries resumed, but now came in unmarked packaging. A new security company arrived one afternoon and replaced the fencing along the back of his property. Karen watched from her window as they installed motion sensors, floodlights, and a compact steel post bearing a sign she couldn't read from a distance. She didn't dare go closer. Her world was shrinking, and every attempt to reassert control, to call a lawyer, to contact local authorities, led to cold deferrals and vague responses. She hadn't broken a law in the traditional sense, but she had crossed into a framework where laws were interpreted differently, where jurisdiction extended through historical archives and preservation acts few people even knew existed. The moment of clarity came one evening, just before dusk. A sedan she didn't recognize pulled into her driveway. 2 men emerged. Suits, clipped speech, government IDs presented without explanation. They didn't arrest her. They didn't threaten her. They simply handed her a formal document acknowledging her status as a witness to potential contamination of secured cultural property, along with a non-disclosure agreement requiring her silence regarding all further aspects of the case. She tried to object, to explain her good intentions, but they didn't care. They didn't argue. They didn't advise. They handed her the papers, asked for her signature, and left. She signed, not because she was guilty, at least not in her own mind, but because it was clear now that whatever had begun with curiosity had grown into something unmanageable. Julian was no criminal. He wasn't hiding weapons or building a secret stockpile. He was something far worse in her eyes, untouchable, embedded within a network of systems that protected him through silence and bureaucracy. Her attempts to control the situation had only revealed her own irrelevance. What remained then was isolation. She stayed indoors, avoided eye contact, spoke to no one, and across the street, behind reinforced walls and shadowed windows, Julian Mace resumed his life, not out of spite or victory, but simply because it had never been interrupted. The escalation had passed, but the damage to Karen's sense of control, her identity, and her place in the community had only just begun. Weeks passed with suffocating stillness. The air between Karen and the world had changed in quality. It wasn't just distance, it was sterilization. The kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful but clinical, like being placed in quarantine. Even when she ventured outside, the sidewalks felt wider, the sky flatter, and every glance in her direction, if it came at all, lasted a second too long, loaded with something unreadable. Julian's house, meanwhile, had transformed completely. What had once been an elegant but conventional home was now fortified with subtle precision. New camera mounts were installed under the eaves, barely visible unless caught in just the right light. A reinforced package intake vestibule was added to the side of the house, and his deliveries now arrived in time-staggered pairs, signed off by courier agents with badge numbers she didn't recognize. Karen counted them. She watched the logistics unfold with a kind of bitter awe. It was no longer just a residence. It had become a node, active, guarded, but humming beneath the surface with quiet purpose. But what disturbed her most wasn't what she saw. It was what she couldn't access. Her digital accounts, once filled with photos, screenshots, and logs of her surveillance, now returned error codes or locked messages that referenced "external audit in progress." Her insurance provider had frozen one of her supplemental policies, pending review of potential third-party liability. The local council removed her name from an oversight committee due to ongoing legal considerations, though no one would explain exactly what that meant. She had become a shadow in her own life, present but no longer trusted to handle the machinery of daily responsibility. She had not been arrested. She had not been formally charged. And yet, everything around her had changed. The breaking point came unexpectedly during a mundane trip to her pharmacy. She was collecting a prescription when the pharmacist politely informed her that her information needed re-verification due to a flag in the health records system. When she asked what the flag was, he could only say that it related to a contact trace anomaly. She left the store without her prescription, hands shaking, jaw clenched tight. At home, she tried to contact her healthcare provider but was placed on indefinite hold. Something was building. A slow burn she couldn't see, only feel, like pressure from beneath the floorboards. She wasn't being punished. She was being processed. That night, driven more by fear than strategy, Karen walked out into her backyard and crossed to the fence separating her property from Julian's. She stood there for nearly 20 minutes, staring through the slats, hoping to see movement, to provoke a conversation, to receive even a glance. The windows stayed dark. No lights, no shadows, no sound. Finally, unable to contain the storm building inside her, she walked around the block, approached Julian's front gate, and pressed the intercom. There was a short tone, then silence. A few seconds later, a mechanical voice responded, not Julian's, but a synthetic program. "State your name and purpose." Karen hesitated, then said, "Karen Whitmore. I need to speak with Mr. Mace." Another pause, longer this time, then the voice. "No further dialogue will be conducted through this channel. All matters must be directed to legal counsel." The gate remained closed. The light above it flickered once, then went dark. That was when she realized that the silence wasn't incidental. It was policy. She wasn't being ignored. She had been firewalled. Legally, physically, digitally. Her name wasn't blacklisted in one system. It was algorithmically untrusted across several. She returned home, heart pounding, the cold settling deep in her chest. For a long time, she sat at her kitchen table, flipping through the printed articles and technical manuals she had once compiled like trophies, trying to reassemble a narrative that no longer made sense. She had started this believing that she was upholding safety. She now existed in the blank space beyond enforcement, neither criminal nor innocent, just flagged, suspended, filtered into irrelevance. But in that fractured state, a question emerged, subtle but persistent. Who exactly was Julian Mace? Not in the way she had initially asked, not with suspicion or paranoia, but with a new layer of discomfort. Because despite everything, she still didn't know. His legal record was pristine, his home professionally maintained, and his collection, so far as the registry described, was lawful, protected, and historically valuable. And yet the reach of his systems, the weight of his response, the network that moved behind him, it all felt too large, too synchronized. Karen couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled into something far more complex than she had imagined, something built not to hide criminality, but to protect from people like her. The realization stung. She wasn't a threat in Julian's world, she was noise. And the mechanisms that had descended on her life hadn't been driven by personal revenge or legal reprisal. They had been automatic, calculated, predefined, and triggered by her own uninformed interference. That night, a second courier arrived at her door. He wore no uniform, offered no greeting. He handed her a sealed envelope and walked away. Inside was a certified statement from Julian's counsel, confirming that her name had been submitted to the Independent Oversight Board for Community Conduct, a regional watchdog group responsible for vetting interactions between private citizens and federally registered custodians of cultural property. The letter wasn't accusatory. It didn't even demand action. It simply acknowledged her status and informed her that her identity had been flagged as a part of an intervention incident that would be subject to review in future registry access applications. In other words, if Karen ever tried to attend an auction, a preservation seminar, or apply for even the most basic archival certification, her name would return a record of this case, permanently. There was no fight to be had. No hearing, no rebuttal, just a footnote in her future, small, silent, and devastating. It was then that Karen understood the true weight of the system she had challenged. It didn't rage, it didn't retaliate. It simply documented, processed, and moved on. And now, so would she, but never in the way she had hoped. Karen's life had not simply shifted. It had thinned, like old fabric stretched to the point of transparency. Every aspect of her daily routine became strained with suspicion, not just from others but from herself. She no longer trusted the idea that she understood how the world around her worked. Her sense of certainty had been broken, and with it her belief that she could predict, control, or even comprehend the system she'd once took for granted. But that didn't mean she had given up. Pride, or something like it, still clung to her in fragile threads. She wasn't going to retreat quietly. If the machinery around Julian was designed to suppress inquiry through silence, she would test how far it could be pushed. She began by drafting a formal complaint. Not an anonymous note this time, but a full written statement addressed to a regional oversight office, claiming misuse of private regulatory authority and overreach through pseudo-governmental intimidation. She cited the automated messages, the digital account restrictions, the sudden shift in her insurance profile, and even the gate intercom response as evidence of targeted pressure. Her goal wasn't just to be heard, it was to force someone to ask questions about Julian. She wanted an investigation, even if it came at personal cost. She wanted to puncture the perimeter that had formed around him, to force light through the cracks. She submitted the complaint through both certified mail and a protected online portal. For the first time in weeks, she felt control returning. She didn't expect immediate results, but she believed that the act of escalation would provoke some kind of response, some shift in momentum. And she was right, just not in the way she had imagined. Within 72 hours, a formal letter arrived. Not from the Oversight Office, but from an independent review council retained by the very agency she had written to. The response was clear and emotionless. Due to her prior involvement in an open federal incident report regarding unauthorized interaction with a registered custodial property, her request for a public inquiry was denied. Furthermore, her submission had been logged as an additional pattern flag, and her communications with any participating institutions would henceforth be monitored for terms of relevance to security-sensitive assets. In layman's terms, she had not only failed to initiate a review, she had added weight to the existing narrative that framed her as a procedural anomaly. She wasn't deterred. She took the letter and turned it into ammunition, contacting a small legal firm she had once hired years ago for estate documentation. The attorney, a junior partner named Ellison who vaguely remembered her, agreed to review the materials. He seemed skeptical but curious, intrigued by the language in the letters and the vague authority of the organization she described. Within a week, he agreed to file a civil information request, pressing for clarity on what exactly had been recorded under her name and why no formal complaint had ever been filed against her. It was a shot in the dark, but it was something, and for a brief window of time, Karen felt vindicated. She imagined Ellison's involvement would force clarity, trigger an uncoiling of whatever bureaucratic shadow Julian had wrapped around himself. She imagined subpoenas, court orders, documents dragged into daylight. But the first reply Ellison received was a simple advisory note, indicating that Karen's name was connected to a compartmentalized case under the jurisdiction of multiple federal agencies, and that any attempt to declassify or review the incident details would require an executive-level override. The message did not come from a courthouse or law firm. It came from a registered .gov domain associated with cultural and material asset protection. The implication was chilling. Not only was the case real, it was sealed beyond any conventional access. Ellison called her the next day and politely but firmly declined to continue. He wasn't rude. He wasn't afraid. But he was certain. "Whatever you walked into," he said, "it's not civil and it's not local. I'm not equipped to deal with it, and I'm not comfortable pretending I am. You should disengage." Karen hung up the phone without speaking, her mind racing. The door she had opened weeks ago now resembled a minefield, and the more she moved, the more it responded. But still, she didn't stop. Instead, she shifted tactics. If the systems around Julian were untouchable from above, perhaps they could be disrupted from within. She began speaking to her neighbors again, carefully, selectively, planting small seeds of doubt. She didn't accuse. She implied. She asked vague questions about the number of deliveries, the strange cars, the signs posted on Julian's property. She spoke softly about disproportionate responses and unusual levels of federal protection, and waited for skepticism to grow. At first, most listened politely, then changed the subject. But over time, a few began to echo her unease. Not in outrage, not with any certainty, but with that familiar suburban wariness, the kind that festers when answers aren't offered freely. She didn't want them to attack him. She wanted them to question. She believed that if enough doubt gathered, the community itself might press back, not against the system, but against the man. And then, just as momentum began to rise, the second escalation began. It started with a visit from an environmental compliance unit, ostensibly conducting a check on her property's runoff management. The officer was polite, professional, and thorough. Too thorough. He took soil samples, noted the position of her gutters, asked about waste disposal. At the time, it felt routine. But a week later, she received a citation for a violation she had never heard of, relating to the presence of non-native plant species that could disrupt localized ecological balances. The fine was minor. The implication was not. Then came the call from her bank, informing her that a flagged transfer had temporarily frozen one of her savings accounts pending confirmation of recent online activity. She hadn't transferred anything. The hold was lifted after a few days, but by then her internet service began to drop intermittently, always during online inquiries about property law or regulatory governance. Her laptop restarted randomly. Her printer stopped accepting commands. Her mobile apps began rejecting passwords that had worked for years. It wasn't surveillance in the traditional sense. It wasn't overt. It was erosion, digital, procedural, environmental. Her life wasn't invaded. It was disassembled. And yet, through it all, Julian remained still, untouched. His house stood like a lighthouse, unaffected by the storm it had helped generate. Karen couldn't understand how someone could move so easily beneath such protection. She wondered if he had friends in powerful places, or if he was merely the keeper of something too valuable to be interfered with. She no longer thought of him as a man. He was a node in a system, part custodian, part artifact, preserved not just by law, but by design. And then, at the peak of her unraveling, came the knock on her door. Not from police, not from investigators, but from a courier. A slim folder. No greeting, just a delivery. Inside, a letter from an office she had never contacted. The language was brief and brutal. Her name had been entered into the National Public Interaction Risk Registry, a private database used by institutions to assess behavioral risk in community and archival settings. The registry was not law enforcement. It was not criminal. But it was referenced by museums, galleries, restoration sites, and historical trusts. She was not banned. She was labeled. She was no longer invisible. She was filtered, indexed, and remembered. And there was nothing she could do. No appeal, no court, no apology that would undo the tag. She had pressed too far. She had forced the system to answer, and the answer had come not in words, but in weight, unseen, unspoken, but final. She sat alone that evening, the last light draining from her kitchen window, watching the world move without her. Across the street, Julian stood briefly on his porch inspecting a parcel. He looked up. Their eyes met. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. He turned and went inside. She never saw him again. The air had taken on a different weight in recent days, not because of the weather, but because of the oppressive stillness that seemed to have settled over everything. It was not peace, it was tension in its final, most refined form, where even the smallest noise felt like an intrusion against something larger and coiled, waiting. Karen knew this sensation intimately now. Her world had quieted not by choice but by attrition. Piece by piece, access revoked, influence eroded, identity compressed into something administrative and disposable. She had not just lost control, she had become a warning label. Yet, in the way of all final collapses, something within her refused to remain folded. Even after the layers of digital erosion, legal isolation, and social disintegration, a spark remained, not out of hope, but out of a grim instinct to force a resolution. She didn't leave her house often anymore, but that morning she made an exception. Dressed plainly, carrying no phone, no bag, she walked across the street to Julian's house and stopped at the gate. It had changed again. New coating on the outer wall, discreet flush-mounted panels where old screws had once been visible, and a newer, sharper scent of solvent in the air. It was the scent of industrial maintenance, of a property not just preserved but protected by design. She stood there for a full minute, waiting, watching the silent camera above the gate. She didn't press the intercom this time. She didn't expect entry. But something in her posture, still unblinking, focused, communicated what the technology above likely read as intent. She turned around, walked the perimeter of the block, and returned home. Not 2 hours later, a letter was slid through her door. Not by courier, but by direct hand, unsealed. It was from Julian. The handwriting was precise, strong, and unmistakably personal. You are hereby advised that continued proximity or inquiry into my residence will constitute a breach of the settlement protections extended to you under terms of passive non-litigation. This is not a warning. This is your final, formal notice. Do not escalate further. There will be no next message. It was a tone that had no voice but total clarity. She held the paper in her hands for a long time, imagining the quiet precision with which he had composed it, imagining the level of certainty a person must possess to speak with such finality. But Karen was beyond defiance now. She wasn't resisting Julian anymore. She was resisting the extinction of her own relevance. The systems around him had never been intended to hurt her. They weren't weapons. They were walls. She had run at them until her own inertia undid her. And now, standing at the edge of what little space she still occupied, she did what most people never do. She broke the silence on her own terms. That night, she drafted a public affidavit. Not distributed, not published, but submitted in her name to the Federal Records Request Portal. It contained a detailed summary of her actions, her assumptions, her motives, and her failures. She included photos, timestamps, and even her own writings. She submitted it to the very agency that had flagged her. She did not frame it as a defense. It was not a plea. It was, in a strange and disturbing way, a confession. Not of guilt, but of her surrender to something she didn't understand until too late. What happened next was swift. 3 days later, a vehicle pulled into her driveway. A different type this time. Low profile, high clearance, bearing no official markings but polished to surgical perfection. A woman stepped out, professionally dressed, holding a leather folio. She did not knock. She stood outside the door until Karen opened it, and with the calm authority of someone for whom protocol is second nature, introduced herself as a representative of the Federal Property Oversight and Custodial Liaison Division. The name meant little to Karen, but the implication was immediate. The woman wasn't there to ask questions. She was there to complete a process. Ms. Whitmore, your affidavit was received and reviewed by the Internal Risk Adjudication Panel. Due to the nature of the security breaches previously recorded, and the explicit content of your voluntary admission, we are authorized to proceed with a compliance resolution review. You are not under investigation. However, your access to all registries, institutions, and digital platforms covered under the Cultural Custodial Accord has been formally suspended. The phrasing struck like a bell. Pure, formal, irreversible. The woman handed her a set of documents, asked for a single signature confirming receipt, and left without further exchange. Karen didn't cry. She didn't protest. She stood in the doorway, watching the vehicle disappear around the bend. It wasn't defeat that she felt. It was conclusion, the moment where even the need for resistance is removed by the finality of administrative consequence. She read the documents slowly, carefully. They outlined restrictions she didn't fully understand, terms like heritage field blacklisting, archival detachment status, and preventative community monitoring placement. Her name had become a keyword in a system she would never touch again. Her fingerprint wouldn't open any gallery doors, her name wouldn't be cleared for access to seminars or collection databases. In an age where identity was built around interconnectivity, hers had been quietly unplugged. Meanwhile, across the street, Julian continued as before, quietly, precisely, but with a subtle addition. A new marker had been placed on his lawn, discreet and barely visible. It resembled a contractor sign, the kind left behind after plumbing or solar installation, but it bore no commercial name, only a seal, an eagle surrounded by an angular border, with text beneath reading, "Property under Cultural Preservation Compliance." No fanfare, no statement, just a quiet declaration of sovereignty. That evening, Karen sat at her kitchen table and thought about the irony of it all. She had approached Julian because she believed he was dangerous, believed that secrecy equated to threat. But the truth was that he had never once reached beyond his walls. She had been the intruder, and in seeking to expose him, she had revealed only her own ignorance, her inability to comprehend the scale at which some systems operated. She had mistaken precision for menace, privacy for concealment, legality for evasion. But Julian had never been hiding. He had been complying, with rules she had never bothered to learn, enforced by systems she didn't know existed, protected by architecture she never realized could be real. Her downfall hadn't been caused by his secrets. It had been caused by her certainty. And that was the climax. Not an explosion, not a confrontation, but a final, clinical detachment. Her story was over, and not with punishment, but with expulsion. Months passed, and the season turned without announcement. Spring gave way to the sharpness of summer, and the trees that once shaded Karen's street now cast long, uninterrupted shadows across the road she rarely crossed anymore. Her house remained unchanged in structure, but something in its atmosphere had shifted. A stillness not of peace, but of emptiness. She moved through her days as a witness to her own life, no longer participating in the world in which she had once felt so righteously embedded. There were no meetings to attend, no correspondence to respond to, no tasks waiting for her input. The digital void had expanded into the physical. She existed, technically, but no longer as part of the ecosystem she had once believed she served. Across the street, Julian's home stood as it always had. Immaculate, untouched, and strangely more distant than ever. The small placard on his lawn remained, though most passers-by paid it no attention, dismissing it as some private contractor's mark. But Karen saw it every day, not with anger, not even with resentment, but with a growing understanding that she had never really known what it meant to live beside something protected, not by neighbors or fences or polite community norms, but by law, by registry, by a framework, too large for her to grasp. Julian himself had not been seen publicly for some time. Whether he had traveled or simply adjusted his routines to avoid any contact, Karen couldn't say. But the absence felt intentional. Controlled, as everything else about him had always been. She no longer spoke of him, not even to herself. Whatever thoughts she had were private now, stripped of the old habit of justifying them through imagined virtue. The narrative she had once told herself, that she had acted out of concern, that she had been brave, that she had uncovered something dangerous, had quietly disintegrated. In its place was only a fragile awareness of how little she had understood, and how much damage certainty could do when it outpaced knowledge. That knowledge came slowly, like recovery from a fever, each realization arriving with a quiet finality that left no room for denial. She saw now that Julian hadn't escalated anything. She had been the only moving piece in a system designed to remain absolutely still unless touched. One morning, a letter arrived by mail, not certified, not marked in any way that suggested it came from an agency or institution. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, but inside was a simple folded card. No greeting, no sender, only a single sentence written in pen. "You were wrong, but not alone." Karen read it over and over again, trying to decipher its origin, its tone, its intention. It wasn't forgiving. It wasn't condemning. It was something else entirely. A quiet acknowledgement that in the great complexity of systems and human motives, error was not unique. It was simply costly. She placed the card in a drawer and never spoke of it. There was no follow-up, no confirmation, no implication that she should respond. And maybe that was the point. The final lesson wasn't about guilt or redemption. It was about the quiet cost of misunderstanding, the irreversible shift in how one is seen, and how one sees themselves after they've been processed through a machine they thought they understood. Karen had become a case number in a database she would never access. Her name had been filtered, flagged, and filed, but what remained of her was still human, still walking, still opening blinds in the morning to watch the world pass by. On the last evening of summer, as the cicadas screamed their final chorus into the dusk, Karen stood at her window and watched a new neighbor move into the house next to Julian's. Young, friendly, energetic. She could already see the beginnings of future garden parties, bicycles in the driveway, open garage doors. The newcomer waved across the street at her, smiling brightly. Karen didn't wave back, not out of rudeness, but because she knew that she no longer occupied the same map as these people. Her world had different coordinates now, defined not by community, but by consequence. She turned away from the window, the sound of laughter carrying faintly across the lawn, and went back to her kitchen. There was no dramatic ending, no confrontation or reckoning. Just a woman in a house, sitting at a table, quietly coming to terms with the fact that some mistakes are not punished. They are recorded. Some boundaries are not enforced. They are simply never crossed again. And some names are not cleared. They are remembered by the system, long after the person has forgotten why they were entered into it in the first place.